to have you here today. So Emily Apter is a Julia Silver Professor of Comparative Literature and Chair of French Literature, Thought, and Culture at NYU, where some of us have studied with her. Her books include Unexceptional Politics, On Obstruction, Impasse, and the Impolitic from Verso 2018, Against World Literature, On the Politics of Untranslatability 2013, The Dictionary of Untranslatables, A Philosophical Lexicon, co-edited with Barbara Cassin, Jacques Lesra, and Michael Wood from 2014, and The Translation Zone, A New Comparative Literature from 2006. She co-edited and wrote the foreword to Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's Living Translation, a collective of Spivak's contributions to translation theory, and has contributed to a number of journals, edits the Translation series at Princeton University Press, and has written very widely on French theory, literature, politics. As I said before you arrived, Emily, I'm really interested in how translation enters the question of the fetish, to the extent that the fetish sort of attempts to create some commensurability across difference. So one thing sort of being asked to stand in for or become commensurate with another. And this seemed to have a lot to do with the politics of translation. So yeah, I am very happy to have you here. And before I turn it over, next week we will be reading Lacan with Alex Colston, same time. And those readings should be in the Dropbox, I think, Hannah. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Emily, thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much, Hannah, for this invitation. I'm not quite sure how I got so late to the party. Did you guys start at 1? Don't tell me 12:30. No.
Just 1.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, well, sorry about that. And I wish this were live and I could meet some people on this call. Please don't hesitate to email me or be in touch afterwards, because I'm not sure we'll have time for all the discussion or questions, but all right, I'll plunge in. So in their introduction to William Pietz's The Problem of the Fetish, a collection of essays that he wrote in the 80s, but which only came out in 2022, edited by Francesco Polizzi, Ben Kafka, and Stefanos Geroulanos. Kafka and Geroulanos write about how fetishism instigated what they call a shotgun wedding that gave birth to theory as we know it, the coupling of Marx and Freud in the 1930s. They point to a Freudo-Marxist tradition that crossed Wilhelm Reich with Theodor Adorno, by producing a vision of repression that foregrounded the contradiction between, quote, instinctual wish and denial by the outside world. That was an Adorno formulation. Qualified by the editors as both meta-historical and imprecisely meta-psychological, fetish theory after minima moralia yielded, as Polizzi observed, quote, a critical dialectical ethnography of the consumer world. This critical dialectical ethnography of the consumer world, along with discussions of what James Clifford back in the day dubbed ethnographic surrealism, was certainly part of the story of how I came to be interested in fetishism. The other part of the story was sex. When I co-edited a volume of essays with Pietz that Wendy just mentioned, Fetishism as Cultural Discourse in 1993, I was tuned into something subcultural that Pietz's astringent philosophical anthropology of fetishism neglected. What Pietz avoided was fetishism's association with garden variety kink. Fetishizing was a performative of the literary and psychoanalytic underground in the 80s and 90s. Fetish sex was on the mind of filmmakers. In fact, one filmmaker, Nick Broomfield, interviewed me and gave me a credit on his film Fetishes, a foray into the S&M parlors of New York. The film attests to the way fetishism was a catch-all for all kinds of sexual practices. Fetishism as cultural discourse ended up with essays that reflected this ethos. There was one by Elizabeth Gross on lesbian fetishism, another by Cabina Mercer on a form of racial fetishism captured in Robert Mapplethorpe's photograph Man in a Polyester Suit. And there was an interview between myself and the artist Mary Kelly that touched on maternal desire and the coprophilic associations between money and anal eroticism. Kelly's image of a pair of shoes in bondage suspended in space, I don't know if you can see it, but there we go, graced the book's cover. Known for exploring the convergences of art, feminism, and psychoanalysis, Kelly came to fame in London in the 1970s with a work called Postpartum Document that was indebted to Lacanian models of entry into the symbolic and the analytic of the stain, which grounded theory in the materiality of her infant son's soiled diapers. It was very interesting, this project. I see Amanda well knows. It was this combination of kind of Lacanian formalism and formalization with these very, very material imprints that became abstractions in the work. Kelly challenged the gendered norms of perversion, desire, and neurosis in ways that were crucial prompts for my own book, Feminizing the Fetish, and for a later essay, which some of you may have looked at, called Maternal Fetishism, that was published in 2006 in a volume titled Perversion. My objective in that later essay was to revise gendered orthodoxies within psychoanalysis and to refocus attention on taboos of desire within the family. I analyzed the fetish as a problem of the object, arguing that in his ethics of object sublimation and perversion, Lacan used Kant to counter Melanie Klein, actually to kind of suppress her, via a theory of das Ding that distanced the object from the maternal body. So as a figure of object lack, or it was called in German the libido house, I'm mispronouncing libido Haushalt, a libido stopper or blocker, Lacan's Ding thing blocked the good and bad objects of Kleinian object relations. Kleinism, discredited by Lacan for being literal and thus susceptible to theoretical regression, would contribute, I argued, to a general condition of maternophobia in psychoanalytic theory. And of course, I'm not the only one to have made this argument. This is quite well discussed. Restoring the maternal object relation in theories of relationality became a way of animating thingness, not dissimilar to the way in which Marx brought out the animated character of the dinglich in commodity fetishism, associated with its, quote, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. And in the new Paul Reider translation, we get metaphysical quibbles and theological quirks. So we can come back to that if we want. I'm actually just coming off a discussion with Paul North and Paul Reider of this new translation of Marx's Capital Volume 1, and I highly recommend having a look at it. It's got incredible notes and some very bold, kind of very interesting variations on all the previous English translations. We did a Q&A last Thursday and talked about translating fetishism and about Marx's appropriation of the term from Charles de Bross's 1769 Theoretical Ethnography du culte des dieux fétiches ou parallèle de l'ancienne religion de l'Égypte avec la religion actuelle de Nigriti, which has been reduced and streamlined in its more recent English translation as On the Worship of Fetish Gods. Fetish comes from the Latin factitious, connoting that which is false, factually adulterated and simulated in the sense of rendered artificial, and more positively associated with the work of art, the fabricated labor product produced by human skill. Marx used de Brosse to think the fetish in terms of the way Europeans come to terms with alien cultures, specifically with African gods and beliefs and ritual practices. He likely had in mind, as North and Ryder note, Hegel's pronunciation of the fetish as, quote, a putrid portrait, naive intuition of the true power of human thought, Geist, falsely projected onto external objects. And you may recall that in Spectres of Marx, Jacques Derrida would hone in on Marx's obsession with animistic ontology, his parody, Marx's parody of the kind of superstitious thinking that for him was just as prevalent in Enlightenment Europe's worship of fetish commodities as it was in indigenous religious practices and beliefs. Marx tapped into the gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit, translated as ghostly objecthood, of the commodity fetish. His reference to Gespenst, the spirit, the ghost, underscored what I think of as a theologized materialism, or even an immaterial materialism, that you could say carried over to the Freudian fetish, itself a secular shiny object, inspiring reverence, and we can imagine the subject kind of prostrating themselves to a sovereign force, and to acts of ventriloquism, spirit channeling, and outbursts of lyrical address. And Wendy actually reminded me of this beautiful quote in Barbara Johnson's, a text by Barbara Johnson on apostrophe, where she writes, apostrophe involves the direct address of an absent, dead, or inanimate being by a first-person speaker, and she cites the famous line, "O wild west wind, through breath of autumn's being." Apostrophe is a form of ventriloquism, writes Johnson, through which the speaker throws voice, life in human form, into the addressee. In The Capitalist Unconscious, Marx and Lacan, a book published in 2015, Samo Tomšić calls this kind of moment in Marx the prosopopeia of commodities, discerning this strange ventriloquism at stake in political economy. If commodities could speak, Marx wrote, they would say this: our use value may interest men, but does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities prove it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. That's Marx. Tomšić, and that Marx volume 1, Tomšić then comments the hidden value of subjectivation, the political economic mystification of value, articulates a fetishist position in which the appearance of value as a positive quality of things is without a subject, or better, that it is its own subject. Now, this is going to get a little dizzying to follow, so don't worry about it if it starts to kind of crash in on you. But I'm just kind of laying this out because it is interesting. And I think Tomšić is going to be speaking later in the seminar. Capital, Tomšić affirms, becomes the privileged description for a spectral life without negativity. And just sort of as an aside, Rosalind Morris, the anthropologist, makes a similar argument about fetishism and the abstraction of the subject with respect to finance capital. And I won't necessarily go into that, but she talks about fetishism is achieved most perfectly in financial capital, when even the mediating function of commodities can appear to be bypassed by interest and later currency speculation. It is, she says, abstraction masquerading as immediacy. So this is all very dense stuff. We can come back to it. I don't expect you to kind of absorb it all. What's interesting, though, in this book that Rosalind Morris and Daniel Leonard put together with a very, very long, almost book-like introduction that accompanies the translation of the Debos, the new translation of the Debos text called The Returns of Fetishism. They talk about how Marx kind of recoiled against the surface of abstraction in his own writing, a kind of abreaction of the formalism of communism that was almost like a fetish in its own right, this abstractionism. And then she writes, noting Marx's kind of recoil, that Marx draws back to reflect, and I love this expression, with unrequited amorousness on the workers at rest, offering us a miniature tableau of conviviality in which they can be seen drinking, smoking, and eating together. If Kant gave us the Tischgesellschaft, the dinner party, as the image of ideal civil society in a cosmopolitan mode, Marx gives us the workers' tavern as its alternative, bestowing almost a kind of erotic halo on the concept of the dignity of labor, but only in its suspension. He writes that the nobility of man, Marx does, the nobility of man shines upon us from their work-hardened bodies. And you could say that in the reading that Rosalind and Leonard do of this kind of extraordinary observation is that Marx was enjoining the powers of adoration of workers' bodies, of the fetishistic gleam on toned flesh, to combat the force of abstraction that was at the crux of his own critique of alienated labor. This kind of paradox and position flipping between criticality and credulity, as we'll see later on, is very symptomatic of fetish theory. Now, I just wanted to mention a bit also on the side here that there are many ways, of course, in which bodies disrupt the abstracted structures of analytic fetishism, including base and superstructure. And I would point to the fact that fetishes, as they are identified, especially in the Freudian repertoire and in contemporary art practice, are often hairy. They traffic in hair pieces, vaginal tufts and muffs, furries, and generalized hirsuteness. Anything really that will advance the all over totemization of the body surface, and anything really that will advance the cause of animality and trans-species identity. So I think actually getting back to this kind of subcultural aspect of where this can go, it's very much kind of with us right now in discourses around different kinds of bodies and transformations. Of course, much more to say about animality. Maybe we can come back to that and its role in contemporary debates over species differentiation, genre, the natural, the wild, the sexually transvariant. And a lot more, of course, to be said about objectification, specifically about how the lure of the object in contemporary culture might be associated with some of the strange forms of self-objectification that result not only in the era of social media and sort of constant self-showing, but also in the era that's a phenomenon that results when the human is divested of distinct attributes of personhood. And fetishism, instead of connoting perverse object attachments intended to ward off castration anxiety, finds a new role as theoretical placeholder for what happens when the enjoyment of ownership, what the French notary refers to la jouissance des biens, with the word jouir connoting bliss as well as representational excess, when this jouissance des biens, this enjoyment of goods, of possessions, bleeds into anxieties around self-possession, definable I think of this as definable as a Faustian dilemma of selling oneself in order to consume more things. Let's just maybe, bring in the idea of the influencer. Okay, that's sort of my preamble part one. I'm going to move into part two. I don't have that much longer. Okay, so many thinkers, Tom Sitch, Laura Mulvey, William Peets, among others, have suggested that one reason Marx adopted the term fetishism was because it was associated with the difficulty of signifying and inscribing value on a thing. The Wertform, the value form of commodities, itself the economic self form, according to Marx, which in its fully developed form is money, is something we must believe in, have trust in, have faith in, from the Latin credere. It yields notions of credit, of extending a line of credit. Belief and credit are at the crux of today's so-called crisis of belief, manifest, I think, in the willingness to give credence to denialism, climate denialism, election denialism, and something I've written on, COVID denialism. Fetishism is crucial here because it is discursively identified with structures of denial, Verneinung, and disavowal, Verleugnung. Both operate rhetorically as negative affirmation, or what sometimes is called technically preterition. An example would be of this double negation, like, I wouldn't say he's stupid, for obviously indicating that's what you think. It's been described as a grammar that allows you to mention something by professing to admit it. So it's very much a disingenuous form of utterance in many cases, and it's a favored construct of irony and satire. Denial was famously analyzed by Octave Mononi in his essay, Je sais bien mais quand même, I know well, but all the same, which became a hallmark expression of discourses around perversion, the mystificatory element of ideology, which Mark drew and sort of analogized with that expression, mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. And the commodity fetishes magic chiasmus, which successfully masterminds in Marxist theory the disguise of what Marx called the material relations between persons and the social relations between things. If there's one idea takeaway from Marx that's associated with fetishism, that is it. Denial harks back to the Latin root for fetishism, as I've already mentioned, factitious, which gave rise to what has been clinically labeled factitious disorder, a complex of delusions and false fronts, fully on display, we could say, in conspiracy theory. Verleugnung, disavowal, in contrast to Verneinung, was a bit more specific, more narrowly applied. James Strachey writes in his preamble to Freud's 1927 Fetishismus essay that Verleugnung marked, quote, a fresh metapsychological development, a pivot from Freud's earlier notion of fetishism, like we're talking 3 essays in Sexuality up through some things from 1909. So the earlier notion of fetishism is prosthetic substitution. The image of women's genitals from below is sort of the classic one, to his notion of the split in the subject's ego, which he writes about more in Splitting of the Ego in the Process of Defense, and refers to the lost grip on reality in neurosis and psychosis. Together, denial and disavowal, both fundamental concepts in Lacan's sense, point to issues of value, worth, and credibility that have bedeviled psychoanalysis as a professional practice since its inception. Here we're reminded of the initiatory prompt of this seminar. I don't know who wrote it, but I'll quote it. I think it's really interesting. Psychoanalysis, we justify a very curious demand. I have to pay to talk. How could it be justified to pay someone to listen? The way in which this question is formulated invites us to continue. Shouldn't the analyst be paying me to listen? What's the deal here? Is analysis good enough value? These questions tap into deep suspicion on the part of the therapized that they are not getting their money's worth. By contrast, the Europeans who bartered in native artifacts, artifacts that were viewed by the church as a blasphemous form of idolatry, but which the church sanctioned officially in the interest of colonial plunder, these Europeans knew they were getting more than their money's worth. In fact, they often quite literally made off with gold. Patients are usually not so sure about the value of analysis. Getting your money's worth is harder to measure in psychic economy terms, an economy based on the unending debts, levies, and legacies transferred from parent to child, defining genetic and Oedipal inheritance, and an economy that depends on monetizing effective social relations. And these things, I think, too, are very much bound up with how we theorize fetishism. In the Wolfman case discussed by Don Moss last week, Freud delves into the homonymic play between the German word Raten with one T, R-A-T-E-N, which means installments, and we can think of sessions paid for in monetary currency, and Ratten, two T's, meaning rats. And we had fun with the wolf and the rat. The Wolfman's father is guilty of what Freud mentions in German as Spielratte, a gambling addiction, gaming, that transferred debt onto his son, the debts incurred by the Wolfman's father. Commenting on this rat currency, Freud writes, "So many florins, so many rats." He, meaning the Wolfman, translated into this language the whole complex of money interests which centered around his father's legacy to him. End of quote. And then Freud goes on to analyze the rat as an organ of sex, specifically of anal intercourse, sketching a set of links between anal eroticism and coprophilic desire. Now I'm going to kind of riff here a little bit because coprophilia for Freud is indissociable from the love of money. In his 1909 essay, Character and Anal Eroticism, he wrote, quote, "Wherever the archaic way of thinking has prevailed or still prevails in the old civilizations, in myths, fairy tales, superstition, in unconscious thinking, in dreams, and in neuroses, money has been brought into the closest connection with filth." And we might also bring in here Sandor Ferenczi's essay on the ontogenesis of the interest in money, where he writes of anal retention in terms of the desire to hoard dejecta as savings for the future. Now, civilization prohibits the accumulation of excrement itself, but sanctions its sanitized substitutes. In this scheme, money becomes the premier prosthetic substitute, the privileged copro symbol, part and parcel of an imaginary that has fantasies of capital purged of stink and stain. You could say it's an odorless capital, conducive to political fantasies, often lethal ones, of racial purity and ethnic cleansing. This ideal of clean money, like the ego ideal itself, is one you can fully believe in, one that in psychic terms delivers good value. Always, though always inevitably a failed or impossible ideal, the money form, qua capitalist cleanser, hangs over and besets psychoanalytic practice, suggesting a complex path, an as yet uncharted path, or set of connections from what I think Hannah Zeven suggested was led from the fetish to the fee. Okay, I'm almost done, and I'm going to conclude. Wendy kind of invited me to do this. I'll not unknowingly, with a few remarks on the issue of fetishism and translation, some of which I've already kind of evoked in the way I looked at the terms themselves. So because this translational condition was super important for Freud in that seminal 1927 fetishism essay. Here, you'll recall, he recounted, and I quote, the extraordinary case in which a young man, I think it's the Wolf Man, correct me if I'm wrong, had exalted a certain sort of shine on the nose into a fetishistic precondition. The surprising explanation of this was that the patient had been brought up in an English nursery, but had later come to Germany, where he forgot his mother tongue almost completely. The fetish, which originated from his earliest childhood, had to be understood in English, not German. The shine on the nose, in German Glanz, G-L-A-N-Z, Glanz auf der Nase, was in reality a glance at the nose. The nose was just thus the fetish, which incidentally he endowed at will with the luminous shine, which was not perceptible to others. So this term Glanz produces a gamut of cognates and associations from glands or glands, chance, mischance, casualty, castration, threat. The list goes on, extending conceptually to Freud's picture of the shine on the nose, not perceptible to others. And this, I love this not perceptible to others because it comes back to this idea that I sort of alluded to very quickly of, it models kind of conspiracy think or paranoid replacement theory. Only I can perceive that shine, that glance. The glance is as an untranslated word, acts as a kind of protective shield that it allows the illusion of the fetish to persist. It deflects from the truth that might puncture the illusion of the fetish. And this brings to mind a really dense but fascinating idea that Francesco Polizzi writes in his foreword to Pizza's Fetishism book. He evokes the apotropaic workings of the fetish. Apotropaic means a warding off, right? It wards off evil spirits. And apotropaic workings of the fetish, where replacement, substitution, and more generally, the manipulation of components all seek to counter the randomness of events in order to predictate their effects, or at least to diffuse them by fragmentation and dispersion, or some form of anesthetization or confinement through their eminently material and sensory qualities. So, you know, that's a lot to, again, to get your head around, but I think this whole idea of what I'm trying to kind of suggest is a relationship here between the idea that's floating around of replacement theory as having this kind of apotropaic function, this that is both that works in this case in a way to protect and its racist usages. I've wondered whether fetishism and translation, and this is my final remark, whether fetishism and translation are joined at the hip or even interchangeable theoretically. Both traffic in substitutions and replacement language. Both defer to logics of conversion, forced equivalence, non-equivalence, incommensuration, and untranslatability. Margins or degrees of untranslatability measured in material residues and semantic remainders. In both Freud and Marx, fetishes translate insofar as they effectuate reciprocal conversions of theology and materialism, of personhood and thinghood, of iconic tokens of belief and semiotic currency. Fetishism's freighted colonial history as a concept is, as we've seen, impossible to disintricate from the problem of translation, starting with the West African and Portuguese trading terms fetiço, faitico, encompassing fatum, fate, trivial object, amulet, small wares of worship, usages that were understood fearfully to contaminate colonizing monotheisms with pagan, idolatrous, superstitious valuations. So all of this, and culminating, you could say, starting from these Portuguese trading terms and culminating philosophically in what Hegel thought of as untranscended materiality, or as Paul North and Ryder call it, a failed Aufhebung. So I'm going to actually stop there. I've given you a lot to talk about. I don't really have a conclusion other than I think that working methodologically on questions of translation and theory together almost leads you back to, in a sense, the practice of fetishism, because you're constantly involved in this sort of prosthetic language, in this and in the theory of a kind of prosthetic discourse, which goes right back to Freud's essay. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was incredibly vast and synthetic and fantastic. I really appreciate it. I want to defer to the group and ask questions, but one of the things that I had been thinking out in advance of this seminar, and you just ended on it, is the question of whether theory in its to that which it describes becomes a kind of fetish. And I'm curious about Pietz's distaste for theory eventually, and how the theory of the fetish sort of switches into the fetish of theory, and how, I mean, there's a lot of, I know you work on theory as an object, not just as a methodology, so I'm curious about the kind of life of theory as fetish object, if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, it's actually, we've heard so many times over that theory is dead and that this generation isn't interested in theory. And if you give a theory course, forget it. Or if you encourage students to do a theory dissertation, they'll never get a job, and that it's, it's too hard, it's too much work. And you want to say with Manoni, et quand même, despite it all, it has a spellbinding effect, because it's about understanding something about illusions and the investment in the concept as a kind of almost a magic currency. And why is that? Because when you actually start to experience criticality, pulling away from face value, or from, in a sense, what American culture certainly promotes like crazy, which is plain speaking and saying what you mean, and not having symptomatic reading, and putting it out on the surface. This whole kind of incredible suspicion of anything that might go along with kind of excavatory languages of the unconscious. But when you actually experience the shattering of some of the complacency of concepts as they're used reflexively and sort of uncritically, that is a sort of rush. That is an experience of criticality. And it's as if, as they say, I think it was, it's a cliche, but the scales fall from your eyes. It's almost like a kind of Greek experience for Oedipus, right? The scales fall from your eyes. You see that you've crossed into prohibited practices. You see what the taboos are that have structured your foreclosures. There is this kind of, I think, immense rush, emancipatory rush even, although it's often accompanied by something truly dreadful, which is putting yourself in a very vulnerable state, no different from the subject that prostrates themselves before some kind of sovereign deity, which is the concept, right? The God term. So I think that's why people kind of hate theory, It has this authority, this elitism, this, you know, speaking to the happy few, this obfuscating aspect that sort of cows people, makes them submit to its knowledge. But at the same time, once that threshold's crossed, I think you can't go back. You know, it's a kind of entry into an analytic mode, and you can't read even a newspaper in the same way anymore. You know, words, and that's also what happened to me with really delving into translation as a practice, not just as something I do or think about kind of, you know, from a distance, but it's that I don't take language at its word. I want to know, what is the word? What is it is doing in another language? We're such a kind of, you know, monolingual culture, even though we're not, but there's this pretense of being one, the kind of English only impulse that runs through things in education. But that's to me what's constantly being elided from discursive encounters. I mean, I also think there's this other thing that I alluded to. I'm going to just stop.
Wrong. Please try again.
Oh, no, my Siri's going crazy here. Sorry. Siri told me something went wrong with what I just said. I'm going to shut Siri up. That's very weird. Okay. All right. I lost my train of thought, so I'm going to stop there. You're
Whoops,
muted.
I was muted. Sorry. I'll take some questions from the group, and also feel free, everyone, to add to the chat, and we can read those aloud as well. Matt, you want to go ahead? You there, Matt?
We have also many comments, but we save the chat, so everyone don't worry.
Yeah.
It comes so quickly, it's really hard to keep up.
Matt, chime in when you are able.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. I'm driving currently. Doing this on a drive between Chicago and Cincinnati at the moment.
Is that Matt Sundell?
Yeah, it is. Hi,
Oh,
Emily.
Hi.
How are you?
Good
It's good to see you, and it's good to hear you, and it's good to listen to this. And I just sort of had a question that I'm really curious about, and you might recognize this obviously from the work that I'm currently doing. But I'm curious if you can like step back a moment and talk a little bit about fetish as a category or subcategory of perversion, and its relationship to perversion as and kind of, and you know, you've pointed to it in a lot of what you're talking about as this long-standing historical category that also has political, theological, I guess, conditions of, and sort of the etymology of it, of like twisting or turning away from an orthodoxy or a norm. And something that I find really interesting about what you're saying is, and you know, in the Marx especially, is that fetishism is kind of the condition of normality in the world of capitalism. But fetishism also, in Freud, signals a deviation from that norm. So I'm curious about this sort of bifurcation of the term in terms of, I guess, structures or infrastructures of the everyday and normality, and how it relates to perversion. And then secondly, with that, like the aesthetic dimension of it. So what, you know, what sort of happens when fetishism isn't just analyzed or talked about, but sort of becomes an aesthetic object as well.
Yeah, those are biggies. I mean, maybe I can sort of start by saying that, and correct me if I'm wrong, the psychoanalysts in this group, because my sense is perversion in psychoanalysis right now is kind of a discredited category altogether. It's kind of out, partly because of its history, its really fraught history of introducing norms that were sexist and homophobic, and, you know, reinforcing structures of the family and, you know, policing. And so perversion, but my interest in it, and I think maybe yours too, because you worked on that whole term in 70s gay culture in Italy, was my whole interest in it was that kind of around, from the late 60s on, it was repossessed, reappropriated, and sort of flaunted as a denormatizing strategy, just as appropriationism often does that. And, it deturns the whole tradition out of which it comes, or the original meanings that were attached to it. And so, I was looking, for example, at Mary Kelly's interest. So Freud, of course, also had a very gendered view of perversion. He sort of said that women were hysterical or neurotic, or they weren't perverse. That was something reserved for the male sex, and it was to do with, objects and drives, and so and the phallus. So it struck me as that led to a whole host of very sexist stereotypes in psychoanalysis. So when we're looking at this period when people are reclaiming perversion in the 70s, especially feminists, which was considered a kind of bizarro act. I mean, why would they do that of all the things they could reclaim? It was considered actually a way of tearing down these gender stereotypes and, in a sense, regendering psychoanalysis. And that led to get to your aesthetics question, to a lot of experimental work. I already briefly described what Mary Kelly did with maternal fetishism, also daring to go open, using it also to open up this question of desire within the family, that has been also pigeonholed in discourses of either, child pornography or parental abuse, or various kinds of breakage of the incest taboo, and there are obviously other ways to think about that, which she was, I think, exploring in very interesting ways. So that was kind of my main example, but you could find many, many others, from work by feminists using strap-on dildos and, ideas of, quote, being the fetish, performing as a fetish, no longer, retuning the feminine masquerade to undermine the idea that the woman is a fetish and that she acts as a support for the fantasy of the phallus, the continually erect figure of the symbolic. So all these things, I think, were in play. And as I think your work delved into, there was a very, very creative reappropriation of the fetish, also in gay discourse, and by extension, the whole idea of perversion in a destigmatizing way.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the
Thank
chat.
you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for joining on your drive, Matt. Okay, so this is from Anisha. I'm quite interested in the specters of race as they appeared last week. The origin of the rat punishment fantasy was a story of punishment in the East. And again, here with the fetish's conceptual genealogy and West African relations to God/idols. You spoke about a fantasy of capital that can be purged of its ratty, filthy qualities, but it seems also to be a constitutive contradiction of capital, the need for a world market and thus a world at all. But this becomes repressed in order for it to function as such. I'm wondering how else we can understand the racial character of capital's unconscious.
Ooh.
And that's in the chat if you want to. It's a really good question, and if you need to refer to it, it's in the chat. Yeah.
I mean, that question almost has the beginnings of a book or its own sketched out answer. I'd probably have to really, really think more about the different nuances. I think that, the thing that there's this whole aspect of fetishism that we didn't touch on, which is linked to its history of, colonial conquest, which is, and racial exploitation, which is that the fetishism was posited as a figure of pre-rational thought, of non-economic thinking, of kind of disinterested form of exchange, and contrasted with with economic rationalism and rationalism tout court in a kind of Western Enlightenment context. So, and the fact that, I haven't really looked closely at the Du Bois in a long time, but Marx is super interested in this. And then, you get the, how it relates to this through colonial plunder and exploitation into questions around not only extractivism of resources in colonial territories, but also of racial extractivism. And that, of course, is a term that we're thinking about a lot these days. So you could say that at the origins of fetishism, as it sort of moves into, as it becomes in a way in Marx, the commodity fetish is the site for this cover-up of not just the human hand of labor, the exploitation of the worker, but also of racial extractivism in its earliest guises, and then all the way through to the present, in terms of, massive structures of, whether it's the plantation economy or resource, cobalt extractivism in the Congo, these South African mineral harvesting and body harvesting, the harvesting of the body parts of the poor in the medical economy. All of these things, I think, you have to kind of take it almost case by case, but you can draw some direct connections to Marx's theory of commodity fetishism as a sort of pushing Marx on this colonial story. He's much more focused, obviously, on the working class in Europe, but it's from the get-go, it's actually a colonial story.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the chat again, unless feel free also to use the hand raising function or chime in if you have questions. Does the translation Lacan gives to libido household have a particular history? It feels relevant to today's discussion that household economy is reshaped via Aushaltung, being able to stand something to overcome an Inhalt content.
Can you just say that again, draw out the actual question a little more?
Yeah, so the question is about the history of libido household, I guess the etymological and the origins of the term, in that it feels related to the household and being able to overcome something.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I was thinking of it more as a beta blocker of the object than as something directly related to the etymology of the household. So I have to actually, do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, we can invite others in after, but I want to maybe ask a couple more questions that do speak to your particular expertise. Okay. In response to the race question, this is from Sarah Sanchez. Do you want to read out loud, Sarah, or do you want me to? Can.
I mean, I didn't necessarily have a question there. I was just sort of responding because I love the Pete's article exactly for this reason, how it like embeds the Fetishism in empire and in like historical material circumstances. So like I super highly recommend. Like I came away from reading today just like wanting to read more Pete's and wanting to think about this question more too. Yeah.
So the sound was a little hard, a little distorted. So maybe Wendy, you could read the question.
It was just a response to the race question. Sarah made the point that the introduction to the Pete's volume is very grounded in a kind of colonial history of the fetish. I have a question for you before I return to the chat, which has to do with chapter 6 in the Pete's book, which we didn't read, but which was alluded to in the introduction, and as far as I understand, is focused on tort law, which is another kind of way of making capital commensurate to something that is immaterial, in this case that being, or material in a different sense, injury or damages, and then also scaling that up to the question of something like reparations. I'm curious how the theory of the fetish helps us maybe think through both the kind of obsession with personal injury lawsuits and I think it also kind of goes to what you're talking about in the maternal fetishisms chapter about this illusion of the possibility of lacklessness that you could somehow make up for lack by you know, finding something that could stand in for what's missing. But it's obviously a very different context if we think about it in terms of individual personal injury, tort law, et cetera, and the question of something on a historical scale, kind of you know, at the level of reparations. But anyway, I'm just curious if you have anything to say about these.
Well, I've actually been working in a new book on translation and justice, a lot on kind of using concepts of the law, restitution, compensation, even things that are like negligence or liability. Liability law is fascinating. All of these things, see, the law wants to narrow their usage. It wants to restrict how these things are applied in the interest of rendering justice, in the interest of determining compensation or reparation or damages for an injury or harm. Tort law is fantastic on this. And I have to actually look at that Pete's chapter more carefully now. And this plays into something that is crucial fetish think, which is that, and you evoked lacklessness, this fantasy that I can be made whole. I think it was Karl Kraus says that, you know, the fetish has to make do with the whole in lieu of the part. So it kind of, it's the whole is in a sense a second best on one level in fetish thinking. It's the poor cousin to the really, really charged piece that bears signs of its lack, that actually carries the full force of its substitution. So the foot for the lost phallus and so on.
Right.
But the other side of this is this, what you know, with lacklessness is an accompanying fantasy of payability, of total payability, as if, you know, that's the making whole in the legal sense. To be made whole would be to have satisfaction for damages, or damages paid. So, but this, of course, ignores, and this comes back to the question of racial surpluses and deficits. This comes back to the question of, say, is the legacy of slavery repairable? Can the law be used in reparations for something that is an unpayable harm, right? It's an unpayable debt. So you get these kinds of twin ideas of lacklessness and wholeness, and on the other, of a repression of unpayability in the fantasy of reparations. And, you know, Afro-pessimism really argues very strongly that, you know, that there is, that, you know, you are too Black for care. You are too Black for reparations. This is a condition that is never, you know, Denisa Ferreira da Silva on unpayability. And so I feel like, but I'm sort of interested in using these legal concepts a bit against themselves to insist that actually, because they're such powerful tools in Western society, they can be critically used towards a sort of reparative justice, and that we shouldn't give up on it. And the fetish discourse is only obliquely related to this, but it is there, I think, in this, and just as you've identified it, producing this, somehow this idea of a satisfaction through something else, through some substitute. So instead of it being the foot or the erotic partial object substitute, it would be a monetary return.
Yeah. Thank you. So I might be going a little bit out of order here, but I'm going to ask Ryan's question. I'm interested if you have any thoughts and or if you're familiar with Sakatopoulos' work around kink and fetishism, particularly in Sexuality Beyond Consent. There's at least some linkage there to translation, as when she describes the creation of a fetish or the development of a taste as the interstitial space between enigma and translation. It seems to relate, at least partly, to Lacan's testing, as mentioned in your piece, of something formed in relation to a whole.
I don't know that book, so I'll have to look at that. It sounds really interesting. Yeah.
We can drop it in the chat. Thanks for that, Ryan. Okay, so one of the things that's coming up in the chat, and maybe can be turned into a question, is the definition of perversion in Freud, which comes from the 3 essays. And maybe you can offer briefly a kind of summary of perversion, and also that will help clarify your previous comment that it's sort of out of date at this point in analysis.
I mean, as far as I can sort of reproduce it, it's about the wrong choice of aim, the wrong object. Very simply, that you're not, you know, in a heteronormative framework of procreative sex, to have an object of an erotic drive, an aim that lands in the zone of anal eroticism. You know, anal eroticism is, in Freud, it's an infantile phase that is overcome through sublimation and through civilizational taming and domestication. And, you know, it's the productive of the heteronormative family. And so any divergence from those reproductive aims is considered perverse. But please add to that. That's
Yeah, and
me just
no, that's super helpful. And I think also it's important to remember that not to save Freud or make him look better than he is, but I don't think the point was to I don't think perversion was a judgmental term. I think it just described a phenomenon that for which he was seeking answers and explanation, how an aim or an object choice veers or diverges, and I think we've read the 3 essays in previous iterations of the seminar, but we can also make that text available if people are interested.
I mean, what's interesting too is that the 3 essays work and this early discussions of perversion come out of a tradition that was, much earlier, starting in the 1870s, where actually law and medicine start to look at, instead of just condemning outright perverse behavior as criminal, they start to, in a way, invent and proliferate. This goes back, of course, to Foucault's reading of sexuality. And they start, in a sense, taking all these case studies, sometimes from literary texts, not even from actual patients, and analyzing things like foot fetishism or male hysteria. I mean, a whole series of things that are aberrant. They call it aberrant, deviant. And there is, it coincides with this explosion, and that's kind of like a subcultural fad of this is when people start showing up at Charcot's lectures and hang out. Early psychoanalysis becomes this sensational script. And as I showed in my very earliest work, I looked into how some of that discourse, from whether it was in Germany, Magnus Hirschfeld, the clinic, and what they called uranism, which was a term for homosexuality, how that migrates into the specialty houses. This is also a boom in the kind of industrialization of sex, and there are also and the curating of specialty tastes in brothels or in so there's this interesting set of crossovers from the clinic to the subculture, to art and to theater, to popular culture and entertainment. And that, I think, prepares the way for Freud's understanding of perversion. It doesn't come out of nothing. It's a whole history there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Any more questions? Amanda, go ahead.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for this. I was curious to hear more about your thinking around I guess, to be kind of flat-footed about it, the role of the artist in relationship to fetishism. I was thinking about your discussion of Mary Kelly's work in Postpartum Document and the kind of traces of desire that make up that work, and how that allows for a viewer to have a sort of control over like what becomes a desirable object. And then I was also thinking about it in relationship to a Howard Singerman chapter from 1999 in his Art Subjects book, where he says that the artist is both the subject and the object of university training. What the university makes us is artists for identity, and the identity of the artist, and that's what's constructed in and by the university and through the discipline. So that the artist becomes a subject of art, as that is their subjectivity, and that only the traces of their work are what can be acquired. And I think between those things, I'm just curious about the way that you see fetishism relating to control, and a kind of capacity to control what is culturally desired, or a fantasy of being able to control that through artistic, like what we find to be attractive in artistic practice, also like how that is a capacity that curators purportedly have in terms of driving what is culturally available or desirable, or something that can be identified with. And whether or not you think that like the fetishistic traces are always what constitute an artwork in artistic practices. I guess to say always is a little bit too much, but if that seems to be kind of a dominant way in which artistic practices are received now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking a bit about the unruly drives, which really raised the question of what is the subject? Is the subject to the drives, simply a kind of joystick that is driven mysteriously? This is the unbewusst, of the unconscious, the how do I know what I'm after? And that's terrifying. This, especially when you feel possessed by a drive, you feel attracted to the lure of the object, or very defined by an aim, but you don't know where it's coming from. It's controlling you. And in many ways, I think the dream of the fetishist is just what you described. It's to, in some way, project a substitute for the fact that you can't figure out the drive. It is going to always be withheld. The knowledge of the drive is not something you can access, just like mastering the unconscious. It's not going to work. And so there is this enormous, and this gets back to reparations and compensation and substitution and prosthetics, this very elaborate civilizational edifice that has to be built, whether as an illusion of control or as a sublimation of the, the fear that you are simply a servant of the drive. And so you could say that, art, of course, does many things, but that maybe one way to think about it is to control it in these ways. I mean, I've always been fascinated by what I think of, and this is not really, it could be taken as a criticism or not, of, I hope she's not listening, of Mary Kelly's over-controlling aspect to her work. I mean, very, very artists who strive for an extremely high level of finish in their work and of control over the manufacture of it and the distribution of it and its archiving and staging from one place to the next. This kind of hyper control, I think, that used to be caricaturally associated with the anal retentive or the control freak. I think in some ways that is a symptom in the work. And it's perhaps not an accident that she tries this kind of pretty power tool move of taking on, the phallic drive for feminism in her work. That's not a small remit. That's a big deal. And to get there, I think, requires this immense act of control, trying to control this uncontrollable thing, partly by recognizing it, partly trying to play around with how to stage what's unrepresentable, which is maternal desire, which is the pre-Oedipal, which is, all of these things that are, very, very brilliantly formalized in Lacan, without representing it, as body art per se. The mother herself is taken out of the picture. There are no sort of biographical traits that it's all been, in a sense, wiped clean. So in some ways, you see this psychoanalytic struggle, for control over the narrative, control over the sexist narrative happening. And that may be linked to, the effort of will it takes to do this, and that art often very successfully can do that. That's what people sometimes respond to, even if they don't understand it, is, wow, that is really insanely well done. Even the whole idea of, virtuosity and skill that's given such a high commercial value, that is linked to this, I think.
I'll just take one final question if anyone has, and then we'll let you go, Emily. Any final thoughts?
I think, was it Yasmin had a...
No, sorry, my Zoom screen was reacting when I didn't realize that it
It's
was.
because you were leaning in a way that it thought you had your thumbs up. You were leaning like this.
Oh,
yeah.
that's really scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate you taking the time and laying this out for us. It was really helpful and stimulating, and some of the citations and references that came up in the conversation are in the chat. So if you didn't catch those, do look
Can you
there.
send me that as a separate document?
Yeah, we can save that. Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And next week we will be reading Lacan with Alex Colston, who is the deputy editor of Chiropraxis and a Marxist clinician. So do come back for that. And the text is up. We're reading Aggressiveness and Psychoanalysis. Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks everyone for being here and for waiting for us to get it started.
Yeah,
thanks again, Salma, for
be in touch. You can
needed
follow
that.
up with me later with emails if you thought of things, and because it's very, very good for me to think about all of this. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your Sunday.
Hi, Hannah.
Bye.